The clock in the hall at Felbridge had not yet struck 5 when Margaret Aldworth came down the corridor in her riding habit, her boots quiet on the stone, and found the study door standing ajar. She had expected James at his desk. They had agreed last night to ride at dawn, and he was never late. But the room she stepped into was empty, the fire dead in the grate, the cold of a late October morning sitting heavy in the air. On the desk, beneath the unlit lamp, a leather journal lay open. She had never seen it before. She did not pick it up. She stood at the edge of the lamplight and read only what was visible from where she stood, the line at the top of the right-hand page, written in James's careful, unhurried hand. She must never find out. Charlotte was clear. 9 years and I have not faltered. Today I nearly did. Margaret did not move. The hall clock struck the quarter hour, and the sound of it moved through her like cold water. She turned to the window. In the orchard below, barely visible in the half-dark, James walked alone among the apple trees, with his hands deep in his coat pockets and his head down. And she watched him, the way a person watches something they believed they understood and must now learn again from the beginning. She had been married to this man for 11 years. She looked at the journal, and then at the figure in the orchard, and she did not know him at all. She did not touch the journal again. She left the study as she had found it, door ajar, journal open, fire cold, and went upstairs to change out of her riding habit. There would be no ride this morning. She did not send word to the stables. She sat in the chair by her dressing table for a long time before her maid arrived. And when the maid arrived, she said only that she would wear the gray wool, and she said it in a voice that gave nothing away. Henry and Sophia came down to breakfast at 7:30, as they always did. Henry had left his Latin primer somewhere and was anxious about it. Sophia had a question about whether peacocks could learn their names, which she had been told by the undergardener and which she now required confirmed by someone with authority. Margaret answered both children. The primer was almost certainly on the window seat in the schoolroom. And yes, she believed peacocks were capable of recognizing a repeated sound, though whether they found it meaningful was a matter of debate. She kissed each of them and sent them to their lessons with Miss Hartley. She watched them go up the stairs. The housekeeper came at 9 with the week's provisions to be approved. Margaret went through the list with her usual attention. She crossed out the second order of beeswax candles. They had sufficient, and added a note about the linen that had been waiting to be returned from the laundress. The housekeeper thanked her and withdrew. Eliza came to find her at 10, carrying a book she had finished and wanting to know if there was another. Eliza was 12, Charlotte's daughter, and she had lived at Felbridge since she was 4 years old, since the fever in Italy that had taken Charlotte. Margaret found her a novel she thought suitable, and watched her carry it away down the hall with the particular absorbed walk she had, already reading the first page. Charlotte's name. Margaret stood in the morning room after Eliza had gone and said her sister's name aloud, quietly, to the empty room. Charlotte. The name completed nothing. It opened instead onto a passage she could not yet see the end of. Charlotte was clear. 9 years. She set the name down and picked it up again, turned it, set it down. She did not eat at luncheon. She told the footman she was not hungry, and sat at the table with a cup of tea that went cold while she watched the orchard from the dining room window. James came in for luncheon at 1:30 and sat across from her and ate. He asked whether she had ridden. She said the morning had not suited. He nodded. He told her the east fence near the lower field needed attention before the winter. She said she would mention it to the steward. He thanked her. Neither of them looked directly at the other for more than a moment at a time, and this was not unusual. It was what 11 years of their marriage looked like most days. the reserve she had always taken for his nature, the quietness she had long since stopped trying to fill. She had stopped expecting anything else. She understood now, sitting across from him with her cold tea and his careful ordinary conversation, that she had stopped expecting anything else a long time ago. After luncheon, she went to the library and sat with a book she did not read. The journal remained on the desk in the study, untouched, exactly as she had found it. She had not opened it further. She had read one sentence. The rest was not hers without his consent. She sat with that decision for the remainder of the afternoon, testing it. She was still testing it when the children's nurse came down to report them in bed, and the house settled into its evening quiet. And Margaret rose from the library chair and went down the corridor to the study and opened the door without knocking. James was at his desk. He looked up when she came in, and something moved across his face. Not surprise exactly, but the expression of a man who has been waiting for something and has now stopped waiting. She crossed the room without speaking and set the journal on the desk in front of him. She placed her hands flat on the surface, one on each side of it, and looked at him. "I found it this morning," she said. "I read one sentence. No more than that. The rest is not mine without your permission." She straightened. "I have 3 questions. I would like you to answer them plainly." James said nothing. He looked at the journal and then at her, and he waited. "Is Charlotte alive?" Margaret said. The silence lasted long enough that she counted her own heartbeats. 4, 5. James answered quietly. "Yes." "Is Eliza her child?" Another silence. The fire snapped once in the grate. He did not look away. "Yes." "Are you the only person in England who is known?" "Yes," James said. "For 9 years." Margaret had believed, coming down the corridor, that she would weep. She did not weep. She found that she was standing very still, the way she had stood in the study at 5 in the morning, and that the stillness had the same quality, not calm, but the suspension of everything that usually moved in her, held motionless by the weight of what she was being asked to hold. "Why was I not told?" she said. "Charlotte forbade it." James's voice was even. He was not deflecting. He was giving her the plain fact. "She came to me 3 years into our marriage. She arrived at the side door in the middle of the night, in November, with a child and a name that was not hers. She asked me to keep her secret. She gave me her reasons. I believed them sufficient to justify it. I have continued to believe that, though I have not always found it easy." "Her reasons," Margaret said. "Which were?" "That the man she had gone with was not dead when the letter said he was. That Eliza's legitimacy could not survive the truth of her parentage without destroying the child's life. That your mother would not survive knowing Charlotte had chosen to remain hidden rather than come home." He paused. "That you would not survive knowing she had been alive all the years you spent grieving her." The room was very quiet. "She made that decision for me," Margaret said. "She did." "And you kept it." "I did." Margaret picked up the small brass letter opener from the corner of his desk and held it, without looking at it, without any particular awareness that she was holding it. "Did you wish you had told me anyway?" James was silent for a long time. The fire had burned low, and the light in the room was amber and unsteady, and he sat in it with his hands on the desk and his eyes on her face. "Yes," he said at last. "Every day for 9 years." Margaret set the letter opener down. She heard the small sound it made against the wood, and the sound was very precise in the quiet room. "The carriage will be wanted in the morning," she said. "I am going to the Dower house. I need to think, and I cannot think here." She moved toward the door, and then she stopped with her hand on the frame. "You are not to come until I send for you." She went upstairs without waiting for his answer. At first light, Margaret kissed both children in the nursery, Henry still half asleep, and Sophia asking with immediate wakefulness whether she was going away. Margaret told her she was going to the Dower house for a short while because her nerves required quiet. Sophia accepted this with the pragmatic gravity of 7 years and asked whether she could visit. Margaret said perhaps in a little while and kissed her again. The dowager, James's mother, visiting that month from her house in Bath, was in the breakfast room when Margaret came down with her maid and her traveling bag. She was a small, sharp-eyed woman of 68 who had survived a great deal and concealed very little of her own intelligence behind the conventions she observed. She looked at Margaret's bag and then at Margaret's face. "Your nerves," the dowager said. "Yes," Margaret said. "A few days. I find I need the quiet." The dowager looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. "I will look after the children," she said finally. "Go and rest." Margaret thanked her and went out to the carriage. James stood in the doorway of the house. She felt him there without turning, and she heard the door, but did not hear footsteps behind her, and she did not look back. The household would see. The household would draw its conclusions. She could not manage that now. The 2 miles to the Dower house took 20 minutes in the morning cold. The house sat at the edge of the Fellbridge property behind a stand of beeches, and it had been empty since the dowager had given it up for Bath 4 years ago. It smelled of disuse when the door was opened. Cold air, old wood, the faint mineral trace of a fire not lit since spring. Margaret's maid went immediately to lay a fire in the parlor. Margaret sat down in the armchair nearest the empty grate, still wearing her traveling coat, and looked at the wall. She had given James an instruction. She had told him he was not to come until she sent for him. She turned the sentence over and listened to it. In 11 years of marriage, she had managed the household, raised the children, made the social arrangements, answered every practical question that came to her. And she had done all of it within the understood limits of what a wife in her position did and did not direct. She had never given James a direct order about his own movements. She had not known, until she heard herself say the words, that she was capable of it. The fire caught in the grate, and the room began, slowly, to change temperature. Margaret sat in it with her coat still buttoned and her hands in her lap, and felt the instructions still sitting in her ears, unfamiliar and entirely hers. James sent the journal to the Dower house on the 3rd day. It arrived by messenger with a note in his hand. "You may read all of it. I give you full permission. There is nothing in it I am unwilling for you to know." The note was signed with only his initial, the way he signed small domestic communications. The same hand that had written the lines she had read at 5 in the morning, the same careful letters. Margaret set the journal on the parlor table and did not open it that day. She opened it the following evening, after her maid had built the fire high and withdrawn, and she read it from the first page. It was not a confessional document. James did not write in the manner of a man unburdening himself. The entries were brief, often no more than 3 or 4 lines, dated and factual. Charlotte had written. Charlotte required reassurance about Eliza's schooling. Charlotte had heard a rumor from someone passing through the village near Rouen and was frightened. And then, woven through the years in the same brief notation, the repeating line that she had read from the doorway. "Today I nearly told her." Followed by the date, followed by nothing else. The decision renewed in silence, the silence itself unrecorded. Margaret counted them one evening, sitting close to the fire with the journal in her lap. She made small marks on a separate sheet of paper as she went. There were more than 300. She sat with that number for a long time. More than 300 mornings on which he had made the same choice. Not once, not in a moment of weakness or cowardice, but daily, renewed. A door he had held shut with both hands every single day of their married life. And she had stood on the other side of it, reading his silence as the natural limit of his feeling for her. 2 days after the journal, James sent Charlotte's letters. They came in a bundle tied with cord, 9 years of them, still in their original envelopes. The locked drawer of his desk, she understood. He had sent the key with them, though the cord was already cut. Margaret sorted them by date and began to read them in order, one per evening, and Charlotte's voice came back to her across 8 years of grief, not the voice of a ghost, but the voice of a woman who was frightened and determined, and making choices she believed she had no alternative to, and who had been writing to Margaret's husband every month for 9 years because she could not write to her sister. On the 14th day, James rode over in cold rain. Margaret heard the horse on the gravel and went to the parlor window and saw him dismount, soaked through, and come to the door. She heard her maid admit him and heard him say he would wait. She did not go to the entrance hall. She stood in the parlor doorway and looked at him from there, his coat dark with rain, his hair wet, his hands at his sides. He did not ask to come further. He stood in the entrance hall and looked back at her. She crossed to the coat hooks by the door. His own thick wool shawl was there, left at the Dower house years ago, during some visit she no longer remembered clearly. She took it from the hook and set it on the bench beside him. She did not hand it to him. She placed it where he could reach it, and then she turned and went back upstairs. And she heard, a moment later, the sound of the front door closing. When she looked from the upstairs window, he was mounting his horse again, the shawl across his shoulders, and riding back toward the main house in the rain. She watched him go, and she stood at the window until he had disappeared among the beeches. The following week, she sent him a note. "I will walk in the orchard on Thursday at 2 o'clock. You may join me if you wish." She signed it with her full name, which was not how she usually signed notes to her husband. She was aware of the formality. She let it stand. He came on Thursday at 2 o'clock. They walked the length of the orchard without speaking at first, the frost still on the grass in the shadow of the wall, their breath visible in the cold air. Margaret asked him about the east fence. She had not forgotten. And he told her the steward had seen to it. She asked about Henry's Latin primer, which had apparently still not been located. James said it had been found behind the piano bench in the drawing room, which neither of them could account for. She almost smiled. She did not. On the third walk, 2 weeks later, she stumbled on a root hidden under fallen leaves. His hand came to her elbow immediately, steadying her. And then, he did not release it. Not for the length of time steadying required. Several seconds passed, and his hand remained, and neither of them spoke, and Margaret did not pull away. When he finally let go, his hand returned to his coat pocket. Her arm, where his hand had been, did not return to anything. She kept walking. He walked beside her. The dowager arrived at the Dower house without sending word ahead on a Tuesday afternoon, her carriage coming up the drive with the particular speed of a woman who has decided to arrive before she can be discouraged. Margaret received her in the parlor. The dowager sat down, accepted tea, looked at Margaret's face with the measuring attention she had always employed, and said, without preamble, "Tell me what is happening with my son." "Nothing is happening," Margaret said. "I needed quiet. The anniversary of Charlotte's death was last month, and I find it affects me more than usual this year." The dowager's expression shifted. She had loved Charlotte. She had loved her as a daughter, and she had mourned her with a completeness that had never quite finished. Her eyes filled. "My poor girl," she said. And she meant Charlotte. She reached across and took Margaret's hand. "And you have been carrying this alone. You should have said." "I am quite all right," Margaret said. "I only needed the quiet." "Of course you did." The dowager pressed her hand. "She was your sister. 8 years, and it does not become easier, does it?" "No," Margaret said. "It does not." The dowager wept quietly, the way elderly women weep who have had long practice at it, without drama, without expecting comfort, simply releasing something that needed releasing. Margaret sat beside her and held her hand and said nothing. And the fire burned in the grate. And outside the windows, the November afternoon went gray and still. After the dowager's carriage had gone, Margaret sat alone in the parlor in the failing light. She had not lit the lamp. She sat in the near dark and understood, with a clarity that arrived like cold air through an opened window, exactly what James had been doing every time this conversation had happened in the 11 years before. Every time Charlotte's name came up at dinner, every time the dowager wept on an anniversary, every time Margaret herself had said, "My poor sister," and looked across the table at her husband, he had held his face still. He had said the right, quiet words. He had renewed the decision in silence, and he had done it again the next day, and the day after that. And for more than 300 days, he had written the record of it in a journal she was never supposed to find. She sat alone in the dark parlor and understood what it cost to do that. She understood it now because she had just done it herself, for an afternoon, with a woman she loved, and it had very nearly broken her. The letter addressed to James arrived on a Thursday morning. Margaret had instructed her maid to hold all correspondence that came to the Dower house in James's name. She had not examined her own reasons for this instruction closely, only that she wanted to know what was coming before it arrived. The letter was in an envelope with a French postmark, the handwriting unfamiliar. She sat with it unopened for 2 hours before she broke the seal. The letter was brief. It was in English, which surprised her, and then did not surprise her. The writer gave no name, only the address of a small village near Rouen, and said she was ill and growing more so, and that she had perhaps 2 months remaining, and that she was asking James to bring Margaret to her before she died. She said she understood what she was asking. She said she had no right to ask it. She said she was asking anyway because she was frightened and because there were things that needed to be said to her sister's face, not in a letter, and because she had been carrying Margaret's grief for 8 years and she did not want to die with it still on her. She signed it with a single letter, the letter C. Margaret sat with the letter until the fire burned low and the room went cold, and her maid came in to ask whether she would eat, and she said no. She sat until midnight. Then she put on her coat and her boots, and she walked out into the cold dark, and she walked the 2 miles back to the main house along the road she had taken 11 weeks ago in a carriage, and she did not send word ahead. The study window was lit. She could see it from the gate. She came in through the side door, the same door she now knew, through which Charlotte had come on a November night 9 years ago. And she went down the corridor to the study. James was in his chair by the fire, which had burned low, a book open in his lap that he was not reading. He looked up when she came in, and she saw, in the instant before his expression arranged itself, that he had been afraid. She crossed the room without speaking. She sat beside him on the sofa, close but not touching, and she looked at the fire for a long time. She could feel him beside her, still and waiting, and she could feel the weight of everything that was not being said. And then she reached over and took his hand, and turned it and pressed it against her cheek. The way a person holds something they need to confirm is solid. His hand was warm. He did not move. She held it there, against her face. And they sat like that for a long time in the quiet room with the fire burning down to ash. And outside the November wind moved in the beeches. And the clock in the hall marked the hours, and neither of them spoke a word. She returned to the Dower house at dawn. She did not give him the letter. The next morning she wrote to him. She enclosed Charlotte's letter and her own, which was brief. I have read this. My decision is that I will go to France. I will travel as a private person, no titles, no announcement, no servants beyond my maid. The journey must not be traceable to Felbridge or to Charlotte's name. You may come if you choose. I will leave on Saturday week. She sealed it and gave it to her maid to carry to the house. And then she went to the window and stood there for a while, watching the beaches. The Dowager came again on Thursday. She had heard, through whatever channels the Dowager employed, that preparations were being made, and she arrived with the directness of a woman who has decided the time for patience is finished. Are you leaving, James? She said, before she had even sat down. Margaret answered steadily. No. Then what are these preparations for? A journey, Margaret said. A private matter. I am not at liberty to say more than that. The Dowager studied her face. Margaret met her eyes and kept her expression even and waited. The Dowager was not a woman who was easily managed, and she had known Margaret for 11 years, and she was not satisfied. But she did not press. She set down her teacup and said quietly, Margaret, when you are ready to tell me the truth, I will be here. The words landed with the precision of something thrown accurately. Margaret felt the impulse to speak, to say, your daughter is alive, and she is dying, and I am going to her. And she held it physically, the way you hold a door against something pushing from the other side. And she said, thank you. I know that. The Dowager left. Margaret sat in the parlor alone and pressed her hands flat on her knees and breathed. Eliza came the following afternoon. She arrived at the Dower house with a note from Miss Hartley requesting permission for an excursion to the village, which was the nominal reason. But she stood in the parlor doorway afterward with the book she had finished under her arm and looked at Margaret with the clear-eyed gravity she had always possessed, even as a very small child, and said, Aunt Margaret, why are you sad? I am not sad, Margaret said. You are, Eliza said without accusation. You have been sad for weeks. Everyone can tell. Margaret looked at her. This 12-year-old with Charlotte's dark eyes, and Charlotte's particular way of standing, chin slightly lifted, as if she were always prepared to hear something difficult. Grown people are sometimes sad for reasons that are hard to explain, she said. It is not anything you have done. It is not anything you need to worry about. I know it is not my fault, Eliza said, with the matter-of-fact clarity of a child who has thought about this. I only wanted to say that I would help if I could. I know I cannot, probably, but I would. Margaret stood up and crossed to her and put her arms around her. And Eliza, who was at the age when embraces from adults were sometimes tolerated and sometimes resisted, leaned into it without hesitation. She smelled of cold air and the particular wool of her school coat, and she was warm, and she was Charlotte's child, and she did not know it. After Eliza had gone, Margaret sat in the parlor for a long time without moving. She understood now, fully and without any remaining distance, what James had been carrying toward this child for 9 years. Every time Eliza had asked an innocent question, every time she had shown Charlotte's face in a particular angle of light, every birthday, every illness, every small moment of growing up, James had stood beside it all with the secret in his hands, and he had not set it down, and he had not let it drop. The cost of not telling landed in Margaret's chest like something physical, and she sat with it alone, and she did not put it down. James came to the orchard stone bench at dusk on the Friday before their departure. Margaret was already there, sitting with her coat buttoned and her hands in her lap, watching the last of the light leave the sky above the apple trees. He came and sat beside her on the bench, not touching her. And for a while neither spoke, and the frost on the grass caught the last light, and the orchard was very still. "Will you permit me to travel with you?" James said at last. Margaret did not answer. She looked at the sky. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to tell you something, not to ask for anything. I want you to understand what these 9 years have been, from the inside." She turned her head and looked at him. "Every dinner," he said, "where your mother spoke of Charlotte, and I sat across from you and held my face still. Every time you said, 'My poor sister,' and you said it often because you loved her, and you were still grieving, and it was entirely right that you said it. I had to decide again, in that moment, to say nothing. Not once. Every time, a new decision." He was not looking at her. He was looking at the ground between his feet, and his voice was level, the way it always was, except that it was also stripped of the usual careful management. "Every night, I watched you sleep and thought about what it would cost you to know, and what it was costing you not to know. And I could not find an answer that did not destroy something." He paused. "I told myself I was protecting you. Charlotte had told me I was protecting you. After a few years, I was no longer certain that was true. I thought perhaps I had simply become afraid." "Afraid of what?" Margaret said. "That you would leave," he said. "Not because of the secret, because of what the keeping of it had made me. I could not be present in this marriage the way I wanted to be. The secret was always between me and anything honest I might have said. I watched you decide over the years that my reserve was my nature. I watched you stop expecting more from me. And I let you believe that, because the alternative required me to tell you something that was not mine to tell." Margaret was quiet. The last light was almost gone. Somewhere in the orchard, a bird moved in the branches. "I am not asking you to forgive me for keeping Charlotte's secret," James said. "It was not mine to give. I am asking you to forgive me for what the keeping made me become in this marriage. For the years you spent believing you had a husband who was simply closed. For every time you reached toward something between us and found nothing there, because I had put nothing there because I was holding something else with both hands." Margaret looked at him for a long time. His face in the last of the light was very familiar, and also she was finding not entirely the face she had thought she knew. "I am going to France whether you come or not," she said. "I decided that before you sat down." "I know," he said, "but I want to tell you my terms." She turned to face him fully on the bench. "From this hour, no silence offered as protection without my consent. No decision made alone that is also mine to carry. If Charlotte's death asks something of us, of the story we tell, of what we say to your mother, to Eliza, we decide it together. I will not be managed again, even gently, even with the best intentions." "No," James said. "You will not. You agree?" He held her gaze, without negotiation. Margaret looked at him. She nodded once, slowly, and stood, and he stood beside her, and they walked together through the orchard toward the gate in the wall where the carriage road began. At the gate she stopped. The carriage was visible at the end of the drive, waiting for the morning, and the house was lit against the dark, and the night was very cold and very clear. "Tell me one thing," she said. "One thing you have wanted to say to me and could not, in 11 years. One true thing." He was quiet. She could hear him thinking, not hesitating, but genuinely working to choose what was most true. "I have loved you since our 2nd year of marriage," he said. "I have loved you with very little reservation, and I have never found the right hour to say it, because the secret was already in the way, and every hour that might have been the right one had the secret in it." He looked at her. "That is the truest thing I have." Margaret reached up and took his face in her cold hands and kissed him. Once, slowly, with the full attention of a woman who has decided something and is acting on the decision. Not a forgiveness, not a surrender. The beginning of a marriage they had been kept from having for 11 years, and were now choosing to have with their eyes open. She stepped back. She looked at him. "The carriage at 6, she said. The carriage left at 6. The village near Rouen was small and gray in November, the streets wet from recent rain, the inn on the square modest and clean. Charlotte's house was 3 streets from the square, and Margaret went to it alone, as she had told James she would, and knocked. And a woman of 42 opened the door and looked at her. Charlotte was frail. She had the particular thinness of someone who has been ill for a long time, and her hair was gray at the temples where it had not been when Margaret had last seen her. And she held herself with a careful economy of movement that spoke of pain, managed, and not complained about. But her eyes were Charlotte's eyes, dark and direct and entirely present. And when she saw Margaret standing in the doorway, she put her hand over her mouth and made a sound that was not quite a word. Margaret went in. They talked for 3 days. Charlotte talked about the man she had fled with. A painter, not of their world. Dead 5 years ago of a fever he had not told her was serious until it was too late. She talked about Eliza's birth, the name she had chosen for her, the letter she had written to James in the middle of the night, because she had no one else who would understand what she was asking and keep it. She talked about the decision to stay hidden, not as a cowardice, but as the only choice she could find that protected Eliza's future and did not destroy their mother. She had been wrong, she said, perhaps. She had been frightened, certainly. She had been living with the weight of Margaret's grief for 8 years, knowing Margaret was grieving, and she had not known how to come back from that. On the 2nd day, James came in from the inn and sat in Charlotte's parlor. And Charlotte looked at him across the room and said, "I have never thanked you. I should have said it years ago, in a letter, but I could not find the words that were large enough." She turned to Margaret. "He did not choose to carry this. I put it on him, and he carried it for 9 years without once writing to me to say he was done." "I know," Margaret said. "I am sorry," Charlotte said, "to both of you, for all of it." Charlotte died on the 4th night, quietly, in the early hours, with Margaret beside her and James in the chair by the window. She did not suffer at the end. Margaret sat with her for a long time after, in the still room, and then she went to James, and he stood up, and she put her forehead against his shoulder, and he put his arms around her. And they stood like that, in the cold room, until the sky began to lighten outside the window. They buried Charlotte in the village churchyard under the name she had lived by for 9 years, in the plot she had already arranged and paid for, beside the man she had loved. The stone was simple. Margaret stood at the graveside in the cold and thought about the small girl who had followed her through every room of their childhood house, and about the woman who had made impossible choices and lived with them alone, and about the letter she now had to write. She wrote it that evening at the inn table while James sat across from her and read and did not disturb her. She wrote it as Charlotte had asked her to. The death placed in Italy, where the world had long believed her to be, sudden but not unexpected, peaceful. She wrote it to her mother and separately to Eliza. Eliza's letter brief and tender and full of the things Charlotte had asked her to pass on. James posted both letters from a port on their homeward road, and they watched the postboy ride away with them. And they stood on the quay in the cold salt wind, and neither spoke for a while. "She asked me to give Eliza a letter," Margaret said at last, "to be opened on her 21st birthday. She wrote it herself. Charlotte did." "Yes," James said. "I know. We will keep it until then." His voice was quiet. "Yes. 9 years more of keeping something." "Yes," he said, "but not alone this time." Margaret looked at him. Then she turned and walked back toward the inn, and he fell into step beside her, and they walked together through the port town in the gray December morning. They returned to Felbridge in the first week of December, and the Dowager received them in the hall with her hands clasped and her eyes reading Margaret's face with the accuracy of a woman who has waited long enough. Margaret told her that Charlotte was dead, had died in Italy, peacefully. And the Dowager sat down in the hall chair and wept with the particular completeness of a grief that has been anticipated for years and is no less final for that. Eliza received the news with a stillness that was not coldness, but the gravity of a child who has long been told her mother was gone and must now accommodate a second ending. She asked whether her mother had been in pain. Margaret said no. She asked whether she had known about Eliza. Margaret said yes, always, and with great love. Eliza nodded and went upstairs, and came down an hour later and asked Miss Hartley about the excursion to the village that had been postponed. And Margaret watched her go and understood what 12 years of partial knowledge had prepared this child for. The household resumed. Christmas came. The Dowager stayed through January. James went back to the business of the estate, and Margaret went back to the business of the house. And from the outside, nothing was different, and from the inside, everything was. 6 weeks after their return, on an evening in late January, the study was lit and warm. The 2 chairs that had always faced each other across the room from opposite sides of the desk had been moved. She had moved them herself one afternoon when James was out, to sit together at the hearth, angled toward each other and toward the fire. James had said nothing about this when he found them. He had simply sat down in his chair and picked up the book he had left on the arm of it, and Margaret had sat in hers, and she had opened the novel she had been reading aloud to him in the evenings since they came home from France. She read until the chapter ended, and then she closed the book and set it on her knee, and the fire made its small sounds in the grate, and the house was quiet around them. "That is the end of the chapter," she said. James looked up from the fire. "Read another." "Tomorrow," she said. He looked at her. He reached over and took her hand where it rested on the arm of her chair, and he held it, and she turned her palm up to hold his in return, and they sat like that while the fire burned down. He extinguished the lamp when they went up. In the morning, their dressing gowns were on a single chair. 2 cups of tea sat on a single tray on the small table by the window. On the desk where the leather journal had once lain open at 5 in the morning, the line visible from the doorway, the fire dead, the orchard dark below, there was now a fresh leather book, its cover plain and new. Inside the front cover, in James's careful hand, 2 names had been inscribed. Margaret James, Felbridge, January, 1847. The second line below the names was blank. It was waiting to be written.